events and other conflicts, we are going to use a recording instead of the actual live shiur from Efrat. Usually it takes place on Thursday nights. Either way, we are going to dive into the Zera Shimshon Drush Gimel, the third Drush on this week's Parshat Chayah, and we continue to hope and daven for the ongoing bracha of the Zera Shimshon, who says that anyone who learns his Torah continues to will see and will merit to see Yeshuot and various other brachot. And Bezrat Hashem, everyone who's listening and everyone who's part of the shiur and everyone who learns the Zera Shimshon will continue to see these brachot in an ongoing way. So in Drush Gimel, in the beginning of this week's parsha, we start off by learning about Sarah Imenu's passing, and with the famous beginning of this week's parsha is Vayavo Avraham lispodo Sarah Livkota, and the pasuk before that obviously is Vayuchay Sarah Mea Shana V'Esrim Shana V'Sheva Shanim. So that's when that tells us the information about when she passes away, and then right afterwards it says that Avram came to mourn her. And the question is, if we look at the psukim a little bit more carefully, we understand some insights as to what's happening in terms of Avram Avinu's response, and also overall, in general, how people mourn and how we should mourn for people who are tzaddikim at that level. So, as it says, the pasuk reads, "Vayavo Avraham lispodo Sarah kodem livkota." If we read the pasuk, it says first he came to eulogize Sarah Imenu, and then before that word lispod l'Sarah comes before livkota. So he already you see tchila adam bochel meto v'asof masbido tishlosha levechi v'shiva le'esped. V'od lama yesh kaf ze'era b'imlat livkota. So the Zera Shimshon is already asking pretty standard questions that are known and commonly asked around the Mifarshim, and he says, first of all, we should be doing is we should first Avram Avinu should have, if we understand what Avram Avinu was doing, we should be saying a person usually does is when a person passes away, we first do is cry, and then we eulogize. We don't do it the other way. And as the Gemara in Moed Katan says, that regards to the first week of Shiva, the first 3 days are meant for weeping, meaning crying, and the last remaining 4 days are meant for eulogizing. So that means halachically, and there is actually halacha about that, is that the first 3 days of Shiva, unless you don't have a choice, you're really not supposed to visit the Avel, because that they're still focused on the crying and on that aspect of the loss. So, and then also he asked, the Zera Shimshon asked, the second question is, why is there a small kaf in the word livkota? Right, that's a very standard, famous question that's asked everywhere. And if we look in the actual Sefer Torah, you'll see, and many Chumashim, you'll see a small kaf. So he says, he offers several approaches to it, and all of them will go through to at least two of them, 3 of them will go through. So he says as follows: V'yuvan b'masha katuv ba'al sefer ma'avar yabok b'ma'amar sfat emet perek yutet. He quotes, Zera Shimshon quotes a sefer called the Ma'avar Yabok, which was authored by someone in Italy around 5386, which is well over 200 and 300 some odd years ago ago, and he says that v'hasped lamet hu to'elet gadol. He says that when we eulogize the dead person, the person who passed away, it offers great benefit to the dead, the soul. Because as the result of the fears that that the eulogizing that we offer, it brings up. He says that this great gates of tears open up, and basically we do is remove or kind of distance the harsh judgment away from the deceased person. So when we come to shed tears over someone who has died, it saves them. It actually does is that the more crying we have, it actually offers more mituk hadin, or sweetness of the din against that would be otherwise be put into place or put against the deceased. Kamram, as it says, Sharei dima lo ninalu. It says in brachot that the crying, the gates of tears are not locked. Omnam, however, tzarich sheyeh habechi lito'elet hanefesh v'lo lito'elet hachomer. He says that the the crying that we do should be to benefit the soul, if you will, and for has some sort of spiritual objective, and it shouldn't just be some sort of material objective, meaning that the crying must be uh, not just for the sake of crying, but rather actually kind of have, even when we're mourning the loss of someone, we should still have some sort of focus and kavanah that the crying that we do, the tears that we shed, are really to elevate the person's neshama. Ad kan l'shano. That's what the Ma'avar Yavok says. U'kedei l'ramos habechi shelo hayat l'to'elet hanefesh. And how do we indicate? So how do we know that the Avram's crying was indeed for an objective, and it wasn't just a stam crying. V'lo l'to'elet hachomer. It wasn't just for material, like we said. Hiniach kaf ze'ira lomar shemi'et b'vchiyato ela mechmat esped l'to'elet hanefesh. Amar lispod l'sarav achar kach v'liv kota. So this is why first he says that the Torah puts a small kaf, the small letter kaf, to tell us that he limited his crying, and he did not cry on a material level. Rather, he was crying on account of the eulogy, which was on a spiritual level. Mishum hachi, and that's why it says first he came to eulogize her, and then he came to leave kota, to weep for her, by saying that Avraham eulogized her before that he cried. It's before the pasuk says that he cried for her, meaning that it says lispod l'sara v'liv kota. It should be what you would otherwise say, which first come crying and then come to eulogize. Here, because the pasuk writes it in this way, the Zera Shimshon understands that by writing the term weeping only after the a with a small kaf, and second of all after the word lispod for eulogizing, it indicates that he was really focusing on the amount of eulogizing that he did was for a spiritual purpose, and the crying that he did was also for a spiritual purpose, meaning he limited the amount of crying he did that was on a physical purpose. Okay, and now that's one approach. Second approach is va'od yesh lomar shakatuv lo zachar b'chiyah rishon. Right, the first, it doesn't say to anything that where it says lispod l'sara v'liv kota. It doesn't shederach lavo b'chmat tevra. Right, it should have come out and naturally. Meaning, when we say is that when the pasuk doesn't say that is not it's not telling us v'lispod l'sara v'liv kota means that there's like some sort of second. It's almost like it's saying it's like there's like a secondary crying. So what the Zera Shimshon is saying is that the natural crying that happens upon hearing that someone has passed away, so he says that it's natural that when a person hears of something tragic, God forbid, or when he hears of something that an accident or something like that, or some other bad situation, our eyes already flow with tears, our eyes fill with tears, and that is the initial one. That's the initial crying. That's natural almost, and the pasuk doesn't have to tell us about that. These tears would not offer any real praise to sorrow, because that comes naturally to any person. So he says, that's why the Torah does not say cry first, meaning leave kotav, and then v'lispodah, meaning that it would come with and writes the term leave kotav with a small kaf to tell us that Avram's mourning sorrow was not just simply instinctive, meaning wasn't just, but rather was a result of his focus on her praises in her eulogy. In fact, if we look at the praises, the Midrash mentions, and the Zera Shimshon has the entire first drush of this week's parsha is based on a midrash where he goes through every one of the signs of Eshet Chayil, and the midrash mentions that every one of the Eshet Chayil is referring to Sarah Imenu. So the first drush, which is very, very long, goes through each one of the psukim of Eshet Chayil, and you can see beautiful pieces about how a husband, a wife, and other aspects of the relationship between a husband and wife based on the Zera Shimshon's interpretations. Indeed, when even the crying that comes as a result of a eulogy, it also doesn't have to mention it. So therefore, we see that the crying that comes when even when nowadays when we go to a funeral, we see the person as they're crying through the eulogy. It's natural that it happens. So therefore, the Bichlal Matay Meneh, meaning that what happens is that even if, that is as if to say that if Abraham eulogized Sarah, he also caused other people to cry over her. He must have been also crying himself. Meaning he's saying is that obviously his eulogy elicited other people to cry. And of course, if other people were crying, of course, Avram was crying too. Chidusha kamash. Well, that means to say that what we learn from this, we learn that even after the 7 days or the days of mourning, the acceptable days of mourning that Avraham took for Sarah or commemorated for Sarah, even after those days, every time he would remember Sarah Imenu's greatness and amazing actions and strengths, and everything that she did, whether it was affairs of her home, whether it was her fear of Hashem, that's his eyes which shed tears of mourning. Now he says this is exactly what it says. That's why we understand why now we understand why the pasuk reads. It says in between the word lispod and livkota, there's a word. There's Sarah, meaning that he eulogized that the words between the words eulogize lispod and livkota, weep for her. Shayalu lamar lispod livkota et Sarah. Right? It should have said lispod v'livkota et Sarah. So elavada shel lispod l'Sarah. Rather, it must be that when it says lispod l'Sarah, kvar nigmar chayuv shayalola. So it means that Avram already fulfilled his obligation of mourning. V'achar kach livkota. After, when it we're talking about livkota, hunyan acher means it's something totally different. Meaning that what we see from here is that Avram not only was careful with fulfilling his obligation of crying during the normal period, but even afterwards, he cried every time he heard or he remembered or recalled some sort of aspect of Sarah Imenu, whether it was her chesed, whether it was a commitment to Hashem, whether it were things that were happening around the house. Even so, he cried. And now the question that is a very interesting interpretation of the pasuk itself. You see, lispod l'Sarah v'lif kota. Lispod l'Sarah is let's call it. He puts it almost like a pause. Lispod l'Sarah, comma v'lif kota. So the Zera Shimshon understands that lispod l'Sarah is one thing, meaning he Avram Avinu eulogized her and created and during the acceptable terms of eulogizing, and then v'lif kota is afterwards, means after all the days that were accepted for mourning and the mourning period, he continued to cry for her, meaning he was sad and disappointed, but he continued to every time he would recall some sort of aspect that would remind him of Sarah Imenu. This was showing us how great Sarah Imenu was, and the relationship between Sarah Imenu and Avraham was that every time Avraham Avinu, even after the acceptable mourning period, he would continue to cry and look at every aspect and say, this is where Sarah Imenu contributed, this is where Sarah Imenu contributed, look at the greatness of Hashem, look at the greatness of relationship. V'od, and now he offers another approach to the whole idea of why Sarah Imenu's name is mentioned in between the crying and the eulogizing. Right? With a very simple question. Why do we have to say that Avram Avinu was eulogizing for Sarah? Who else would it have been for, right? We already know that Sarah Imenu died. So, of course, the next pasuk is going to talk about Sarah Imenu. There's no question about the pasuk. It's almost obvious. We just said, if the pasuk would have just read, Avram came to cry and eulogize, or eulogize and cry, for with the way the language and the way the grammar reads in Hebrew, we would have understood, especially when it says lifkota v'lispoda or lispod lisabda v'lifkota, we would have understood that it's referring to Sarah Imenu, right? Elamishum de kaimelan. Rather, the word Sarah is added to give us a certain kind of. It comes to teach us a certain kind of law about married women. Ola imo v'nayured, that she rises to the station of her and does not descend with him. Meaning that if a woman is married to a man whose stature is greater than hers, she is treated in accordance with his stature. So what happens? So it's as if to say that a person, when a husband is in a great level of a tzaddik, like Avraham Avinu, when Sarah died, when they got married, Sarah elevated herself, basically kind of rose up, and then now she is viewed as Avram Avinu's wife, meaning the person is viewed as in the eyes of the husband. And so when a woman is eulogized not only on account of her own accomplishments, which is obvious, but she's also on the account of her husband. Therefore it says, but then what would you say? We would say is that maybe the eulogizing that happens that happened in this case, maybe we would say, oh, so then all the eulogizing and all the crying is really just because she was related to Avram Avinu. And that's why the pasuk comes to say, lispod l'sarah, and emphasis on l'sarah, to teach us, Avraham lo ba laspid l'sarah b'shvil shayata ishto b'vad. Avram Avinu, and this comes to be a limud zchut on Avram Avinu, to teach us that Avram Avinu not only cried, or specifically didn't cry, only about her greatness and her relationship to Avraham, because that would be almost like an obvious kind of thing. He says, no, the pasuk says, rather on account of the own merit and the credits that she deserved and earned for herself, as she is, who as a personality. So even if she, and this the Zera Shimshon is bringing a tremendous chidush, even if she was not been his wife, Avram Avinu is praising her, and in her eulogy he's praising her for the greatness that was Sarah Imenu. And this is similar to this could be understood in a similar way. The way in Beishit Rabbah it says that there are certain extra words, and when it says im beni im Yitzchak, right? When we look in last week's parsha, declare that last week's parsha we see that Sarah says that Yishmael should not share in the inheritance of Yitzchak Avinu, right? So it says im beni afilu eno Yitzchak, right? It says that that the Midrash understands that Sarah meant to say is that with my son, even if he was not Yitzchak, even if you were not my son, Sarah Imenu didn't want Yitzchak, or whoever the son would be, didn't want Yishmael to be influenced with her son, that is the one that's going to be born, to be influenced by Yishmael. So what do we learn from this one? From this third interpretation, we see that Avram Avinu, besides the relationship that they had, which was amazing and unique, the pasuk tells us how unique she was. That Avram Avinu not only did he, or be an addition, or maybe perhaps even the eulogy that Avram Avinu performed for and said and cried over for Sarah Imenu was not because her relationship to Avraham. That would have been almost like an obvious eulogy. What he's saying here is that it's unique, and the credit and the eulogy that they gave was so great that it says lispod l'sarah, specifically Sarah, because otherwise the word is not unnecessary. So he says, look how great. The pasuk says, look how great Avram is, that besides the relationship that they had and the amazing person she was, because she was married to Avram Avinu. That's one aspect of her greatness. But Avram Avinu's eulogy was so great that he was eulogizing her greatness, even if she was not his wife, meaning her own midot and her own characteristics were so great that he offered an even more unique eulogy because it was for Sarah Imenu specifically, and not just in association of. So these three small perushim teach us about someone's greatness and someone as Avram Avinu, but in general, we learn about how a person can depict a story about another person, not only from the eyes of who they're related to or who they're associated to, but rather our goal is to highlight who they are as people and who we are. We should be highlighting who we are as people, and not just say, oh, you're married to or you're friends with, but rather we should be looking at the person for who they are and unique characteristics that make them so worthy and so special, because those are the things that people remember, and those are the things that we should be really viewing. And as you could see from Avram Avinu, at least in the last drush of this part, the Zera Shimshon says, look how special a person was, that even Avram Avinu, who was married to Sarah, and Sarah was a great person because she was married to Avram, he eulogized her for the greatness of who she was and who the person she was.